Before we begin this tale of sacrifice, unexpected love, and the cruel Grand Duke who proposed to the eldest spinster, I have a small request. If stories of overlooked women finding their worth resonate with you, if you believe everyone deserves a chance at love regardless of age or circumstance, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these stories of hope and transformation. Now, let me tell you about Millie Simpson, Gloucester, 1807. The spring garden party at Hartwell Manor should have been a celebration, but for Millie Simpson, it was merely another afternoon of watching her dreams bloom in others' hands. At 27, she stood at the edge of the manicured lawn, her simple rose-colored gown a stark contrast to the elaborate silks swirling around her. The air hummed with congratulations. Her youngest sister, Jane, had just announced her engagement to Viscount Pemberton, the third brilliant match among the Simpson daughters in as many seasons. In the center of the garden, beneath a canopy of white roses, her three sisters held court like queens. Elizabeth, now Countess of Worthington, her auburn curls crowned with pearls; Charlotte, the new Countess of Ashford, resplendent in sapphire silk that matched her engagement ring; and Jane, barely 20, blushing as Viscount Pemberton kissed her gloved hand while society watched and approved. They were a vision of everything the ton valued: youth, beauty, grace, and now brilliant alliances. Millie remained at the periphery, as she always did, a shadow in rose-colored muslin, the forgotten daughter with brown hair, neither fashionably dark nor attractively fair, with hazel eyes that were merely pleasant, with a figure that was simply adequate. At 27, she had long since accepted her role as the spinster sister, the one who would never quite fit into the glittering world her siblings inhabited so naturally. 3 daughters married to peers of the realm, Lady Hartwell announced, her voice carrying across the garden with the clarity of a town crier. She approached Millie with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your father must be beside himself with joy, Miss Simpson. What a remarkable transformation for the family." Millie managed a practiced smile, the kind that had become her armor over years of standing in her sister's shadows. "My family is most fortunate, indeed, Lady Hartwell." "Fortunate?" The older woman's eyes glittered with knowing malice. "I should say miraculous, my dear. Why, I remember when your dear father was cashiered out of the regiment, no, forgive me, when he retired from military service. His circumstances seemed so very reduced. Yet somehow, 3 elaborate seasons, 3 trousseaux worthy of royalty, 3 matches that would make any duchess weep with envy. One might wonder at the source of such providence." Heat crept up Millie's neck, but she kept her voice steady. "Providence has been kind to us." What Lady Hartwell didn't know, what polite society would never acknowledge, was that those 3 fortunate matches had been purchased with Millie's inheritance. The £12,000 her maternal aunt had left her, meant to be her security, her independence, her one chance at a future, had been quietly drained over 5 years to fund elaborate seasons, expensive wardrobes, and the social connections that had elevated her sisters from country gentry to the aristocracy. 5 years ago, when her father had turned to her with desperate eyes, his hands trembling as he spread the creditor notices across his desk, she had not hesitated. Someone had to save the Simpson name, and as the eldest, plainest daughter, with no prospects of her own, she understood her role. "Papa's investments in the cotton trade have recovered remarkably," came a familiar, poisonous voice. Millie turned to find Mrs. Cordelia Winters, her father's sister and a woman who had made cruelty into an art form. She stood with her walking stick planted like a weapon, her sharp features arranged in an expression of false concern. "Though one wonders how," Aunt Cordelia continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried to everyone nearby, "given that every venture he touches seems to wither. Tell me, Millie, how does it feel to watch your sisters dance at their engagement balls while you fade into spinsterhood? Jane is barely 20, and already she's secured a viscount. Meanwhile, you grow older by the season, with nothing to show for your youth but the satisfaction of playing martyr." The words landed like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Around them, conversations had faltered. People were listening now, watching to see how the spinster sister would respond to such public humiliation. "My sister's happiness is my own," Millie replied quietly, though her fingers trembled against the fan she clutched like a lifeline. "How noble!" Aunt Cordelia's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Though nobility doesn't keep one warm at night, does it? It doesn't provide children to carry on one's name, or a household to manage, or any purpose beyond watching from the margins while life passes you by. Millie felt something inside her crack, a hairline fracture in the careful composure she had maintained for so long. "Excuse me," she murmured, not waiting for permission before retreating toward the house. Behind her, she heard Aunt Cordelia's carrying voice. Such sensitivity. One would think she'd grown accustomed to her circumstances by now. The laughter that followed pursued Millie across the lawn. She found refuge in Hartwell's library, a room blessedly empty during the garden festivities. Millie pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching the celebration continue without her. Her sisters laughed with their handsome fiancés and husbands. Her father beamed with restored pride, and the world moved forward as though her sacrifice had been not just necessary, but expected. What remained for Millie Simpson? A modest chamber in her father's crumbling estate, a wardrobe of remade gowns, each one altered and dyed to disguise its age, the certain knowledge that her chances for marriage, for children, for a life of her own, had been spent purchasing her sister's happiness. She had given everything, and it had not been enough to earn even gratitude, only the expectation of continued silence. They say libraries are sanctuaries for those seeking escape. Millie spun around, her heart lurching. A man stood in the doorway, tall, imposing, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they touched. She recognized him instantly, though they had never been introduced. Henry Parsons, Duke of Gloucester, was impossible not to recognize. At 35, he was one of England's wealthiest peers and, by reputation, its cruelest. "Your Grace." Millie dropped into a curtsy, her mind racing. "Forgive me. I didn't realize that I attend tedious garden parties." His voice was cold, clipped, each word precise as a blade. "I don't, typically. I came to discuss business with Colonel Simpson. Instead, I've been subjected to 2 hours of insipid conversation about nothing of consequence." He moved into the room with predatory grace, and Millie found herself taking an involuntary step backward. Up close, the Duke was even more formidable, all sharp angles and aristocratic severity, with eyes the color of winter steel that seemed to miss nothing. He circled her slowly, his gaze assessing. "You're the eldest daughter," he said finally, not a question but a statement of fact. "The one who didn't marry." The words hung in the air between them, as cutting as they were casual. Millie felt heat flood her cheeks, but she lifted her chin and met the Duke's cold gaze directly. "I am Millicent Simpson, yes, Your Grace. The martyr daughter," he continued, his tone as detached as if he were discussing the weather. He completed his slow circle around her, cataloguing her modest gown, her simple hairstyle, her worn gloves. "The one who sacrificed her dowry so her sisters could marry above their station. Interesting financial strategy, foolish, but interesting." Millie's breath caught. "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace." "Don't insult my intelligence, Miss Simpson." He moved to the library window, his back to her now, hands clasped behind him. "I make it my business to know the financial circumstances of families I might engage with. Your father, Colonel Andrew Simpson, owes £8,000 to various creditors. His annual income barely covers household expenses. Yet somehow, 3 daughters have been launched into society with considerable expense, wardrobes, seasons, connections, all requiring substantial capital." He turned back to face her, his grey eyes sharp as winter frost. "The mathematics aren't difficult. Your maternal aunt left you £12,000 when you were 22. Over the subsequent 5 years, that inheritance has been systematically depleted. Your father's miraculous recovery coincides precisely with your loss of fortune. Even a mediocre mathematician could solve that equation." Millie felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. No one was supposed to know. The sacrifice had been made quietly, privately, with the understanding that her sisters would never bear the shame of knowing the true cost of their elevation. "My father's affairs are his own concern, Your Grace," she said quietly, though her voice trembled. Something flickered in the Duke's expression, perhaps approval, perhaps merely calculation. "Indeed, though they're about to become very public concerns unless someone intervenes." "What do you mean?" "Your father's largest creditor, Lord Wickham, is calling in the debt. He grows impatient with promises and partial payments. Within a month, your father faces complete ruin, public disgrace, potential imprisonment for debt, and certainly the dissolution of your sister's advantageous matches." The Duke's voice remained clinical, as though he were discussing crop rotations rather than her family's destruction. No peer wishes to ally himself with bankruptcy and scandal, Miss Simpson. Those 3 brilliant engagements will evaporate like morning mist. The library seemed to tilt. Milly pressed her hand against the bookshelf beside her, needing its solidity. "How do you know this?" "Because I purchased his debts yesterday," the Duke replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "All £8,000 worth." Lord Wickham was eager to divest himself of the obligation. "I acquired the notes for 7,000, quite the bargain." Milly stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. "Why would you—" "I have a proposition for you, Miss Simpson." He moved away from the window, his tall frame seeming to fill the intimate space of the library. "I require a wife, not for the usual sentimental reasons that drive most men to matrimony, but for practical purposes. I need someone capable of managing my estates, someone who understands sacrifice and duty, someone who won't harbor foolish romantic expectations about our arrangement." The words struck Milly like physical blows. "You're proposing marriage?" "I'm proposing a transaction." His voice hardened. "You marry me, become Duchess of Gloucester, and manage my household with the same efficiency you've demonstrated in sacrificing your own prospects for your family's advancement. In exchange, I forgive your father's debts entirely, all £8,000. I settle £5,000 on each of your married sisters as additional dowry enhancement, ensuring their positions remain secure. And I provide you with an annual income of £3,000 for your personal use, ensuring your independence should you ever require it." Milly's throat had gone dry. "But why me? Surely any woman in England would. Any woman in England would expect affection, courtship, romantic attachment." The Duke's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes suggested old wounds carefully sealed. "I don't traffic in such things, Miss Simpson. I've seen what sentiment does to people. It makes them weak, vulnerable, destructive. Love is a pleasant fiction that poets peddle to the gullible. In reality, it leads only to disappointment and ruin." He crossed to stand before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the severe set of his mouth. "I want a wife who understands that marriage is a business arrangement, nothing more. You've already proven you can make hard choices without emotional nonsense clouding your judgment. You sacrificed your dowry, your season, your youth, all for your family's benefit, expecting nothing in return. That demonstrates the practical capability I require." Milly looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time saw past his severe exterior to something else, a carefully constructed fortress, built stone by stone to keep the world at arm's length. Whatever had made Henry Parsons into the cruel Duke of Gloucester had also made him profoundly, desperately alone. "What if I refuse?" she asked quietly. His expression didn't change. "Then I call in your father's debts tomorrow morning. The Simpson family faces public disgrace within a fortnight. Your sister's engagements will be broken. No gentleman of rank tolerates scandal by association. Your father will likely face debtor's prison. And you, Miss Simpson, will have sacrificed everything for nothing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over her. "You've given away your dowry, your prospects, your future. This is merely one more sacrifice. Though at least this one comes with a coronet and financial security. You'll be a duchess, mistress of 6 estates, with more power and wealth than most women could dream of possessing. Is that not preferable to watching everything you've sacrificed for crumble to dust?" The cruelty of it took her breath away, not because he was wrong, but because he was absolutely, devastatingly right. She had nothing left to give except herself, and here stood a man willing to purchase even that final sacrifice with cold, calculating efficiency. Through the window, Milly could see her sisters still laughing in the garden, Jane showing off her ring to a cluster of admirers, Elizabeth and Charlotte beaming with sisterly pride, their futures secure, their happiness assured, all built on the foundation of her invisible sacrifice. "I need time to consider," Milly said, though the words felt hollow. She already knew her answer. She had always known her answer. From the moment she gave away her first penny for her sister's futures, this had been her inevitable destination. "You have until tomorrow evening," the Duke replied, moving toward the door. "I'll call at 8 o'clock. We can finalize arrangements then." He paused at the threshold, glancing back at her one final time. In the afternoon light slanting through the window, his severe features looked carved from marble, beautiful in a cold, remote way, like a statue of a forgotten god. "Don't mistake this for kindness, Miss Simpson. I'm not rescuing you. I'm acquiring a competent duchess at a reasonable price. Nothing more. After he left, Millie sank into a leather chair, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together. Through the window, she watched her sisters dancing with their beloveds, watched her father accepting congratulations from Lord Hartwell, watched the celebration continue as though her world hadn't just tilted on its axis. The cruel Duke of Gloucester had proposed to the eldest spinster, and Millie Simpson, who had already given away everything else, would give away herself as well. It was, she thought with bitter irony, exactly what was expected of her. Millie did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the modest chamber that had been hers since childhood, staring at the ceiling while moonlight crept across the faded wallpaper. The same cracks in the plaster that she had traced 1,000 times before seemed to mock her now, a map of all the ways her life had fractured without her noticing. Marriage to the Duke of Gloucester, becoming a duchess. It should have been the fantasy of every unmarried woman in England. Instead, it felt like signing her own death warrant, not of her body, but of any hope she had secretly harbored, that someday, somehow, someone might choose her for herself rather than her utility. I'm acquiring a competent duchess at a reasonable price. The words echoed in her mind, with the finality of a prison door closing. She rose before dawn and went to the window. In the garden below, remnants of yesterday's celebration still lingered. Ribbons tied to the rose arbor, champagne glasses forgotten on tables. The physical evidence of joy, left behind like debris after a storm. Millie? She turned to find Jane standing in the doorway, still in her nightgown, her young face radiant with the kind of happiness that seemed to glow from within. At 20, Jane embodied everything. Millie was not beautiful, vivacious, effortlessly charming. "I saw your candle burning," Jane said, gliding into the room with the unconscious grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "I couldn't sleep either. I keep thinking about the wedding, about being Viscountess Pemberton. Can you imagine? Me, a Viscountess." "It's wonderful, Jane," Millie managed, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "We're all so lucky, aren't we?" Jane settled on the edge of Millie's bed, drawing her knees up like a child. "Elizabeth a countess, Charlotte a countess, and now me. And it's all thanks to Papa's investments recovering so miraculously. When I think how close we came to ruin after Mama died," she shuddered delicately, "but Providence smiled on us, didn't it? Papa's cotton ventures succeeded just when we needed them most." Millie turned back to the window, unable to bear the innocence in her sister's eyes. Jane had no idea. None of them did. They believed in their father's fictional business acumen, in Providence's timely intervention, in their own deserving good fortune. "Yes," Millie said quietly. "Providence. You'll find someone too," Jane added with the careless optimism of youth. "I know you're 27, but that's not so terribly old. Perhaps a widower with children who needs a sensible wife, or a country gentleman who values practicality over beauty." The words were meant to comfort but landed like stones. Millie closed her eyes against the sting. "Perhaps," she whispered. After Jane left, Millie dressed mechanically, choosing a simple morning gown of grey muslin that matched her mood. She descended to the breakfast room to find her father already there, though "there" was perhaps too generous a description. Colonel Andrew Simpson sat slumped at the table, his face haggard, his hands trembling as he raised a coffee cup to his lips. "Millie," he said, his voice hoarse. "Good morning, my dear." "Papa." She took her seat, studying him with concern. At 53, her father looked a decade older. The years since her mother's death had not been kind. Each failed investment, each desperate scheme, had carved new lines into his once handsome face. "Quite a celebration yesterday," he continued, not meeting her eyes. "Jane looked beautiful, didn't she? All my girls, so accomplished, so well settled." "Yes, Papa." He set down his cup with a clatter. "Millie, there's something I should tell you. The creditors, they've been quite persistent lately. Lord Wickham, in particular, has been making noises about calling in his notes. I've managed to put him off thus far, but I fear," he broke off, running a shaking hand through his thinning hair, "I fear we may face some difficulties soon." Millie looked at her father, this man who had been a hero once, decorated for valor in the peninsula, respected by his regiment. Grief and poor judgment had reduced him to this, a trembling, desperate creature drowning in debts of his own making, and she was about to save him one final time. "Papa," she said quietly, "I believe our difficulties may soon be resolved." That evening, at precisely 8 o'clock, The Duke of Gloucester's carriage appeared in the drive. Milly stood in the drawing room, her father beside her, as the butler announced their guest. Henry Parsons entered with the same cold precision he had displayed in the library, his dark evening clothes immaculate, his expression revealing nothing. "Your Grace," Colonel Simpson said, bowing too deeply, too eagerly. "What an unexpected honor. Please, sit. May I offer you brandy?" "Thank you, no." The Duke remained standing, his grey eyes finding Milly's across the room. "I've come for Miss Simpson's answer to the proposition I made yesterday." Her father looked between them, confused. "Proposition?" "Yes." Milly's voice was steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. She had made her choice in the grey hours before dawn, weighing one impossible option against another. She could not let her sister's futures collapse, not after everything she had already sacrificed. "Your Grace, I accept your terms." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, satisfaction, perhaps, or relief. "Excellent. Accept what terms?" Her father's confusion had sharpened to alarm. "Milly, what is this about?" "Colonel Simpson," the Duke said, turning his attention to her father. "I have asked your daughter to be my wife. She has accepted. I trust this meets with your approval." The color drained from her father's face, then flooded back. "Your Grace, this is... Milly, is this true?" "Yes, Papa. But this is extraordinary. Wonderful. My daughter, a duchess." Tears sprang to his eyes, tears of relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Your Grace, you honor our family beyond measure. I don't know how to express my gratitude." "No gratitude is necessary," the Duke replied with clinical precision. "This is a business arrangement that serves both our interests. Now, if we may proceed to the particulars." He moved to the door and opened it. A thin, severe-looking man entered, carrying a leather case. "This is Mr. Graves, my solicitor. He has prepared the marriage settlements for review." What followed was perhaps the most surreal hour of Milly's life. She sat in her father's shabby drawing-room while Mr. Graves laid out documents with the efficiency of a general deploying troops. The Duke stood by the window, contributing occasional corrections but otherwise remaining detached, as though negotiating the purchase of livestock rather than a marriage. "All of Colonel Simpson's outstanding debts, totaling £8,000, will be satisfied immediately upon the marriage," Mr. Graves explained. "Additionally, £5,000 will be settled upon each of Miss Simpson's married sisters." Her father made a choking sound. The Duke's gaze remained fixed on the darkening garden beyond the window. "Miss Simpson will receive an annual allowance of £3,000 for her exclusive use," Mr. Graves continued. "Separate chambers will be maintained at all ducal residences. Upon His Grace's death, Miss Simpson, that is, Her Grace will receive Meadowbrook House in Surrey, and an annual income of £5,000 as her widow's portion." Milly's hands clenched in her lap. Every term, every clause, reinforced what this marriage would be: a transaction, nothing more. "There is no provision for children," Mr. Graves added delicately. "His Grace and Miss Simpson have agreed this is to be a marriage of practical convenience." The words hung in the air like a funeral bell. Her father, still dazed by his sudden salvation, seemed not to register the significance, but Milly felt each syllable like a door closing on every dream she had buried, but never quite killed. "If these terms are acceptable," the Duke said, finally turning from the window, "we will marry by special license in 3 days' time. I see no reason for delay." 3 days? Milly's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Is there any purpose in waiting longer?" His grey eyes met hers, and she saw the challenge there. He was testing her, she realized, to see if she would balk at the final moment. She lifted her chin. "No, Your Grace. 3 days is perfectly acceptable." "Excellent." He nodded to Mr. Graves, who produced more documents. "If you'll sign here, Miss Simpson, and here, Colonel Simpson." Milly's hand trembled as she took the pen, but her signature was steady. Millicent Ann Simpson, written in ink that would bind her to this cold stranger for the rest of her life. Her father signed with tears streaming down his face, murmuring prayers of gratitude that made Milly's stomach turn. "The arrangements are complete," the Duke said, collecting the signed documents. "I'll send my carriage at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. We'll marry at St. George's Chapel. Immediate family only." He moved toward the door, then paused, glancing back at Milly one final time. "I trust you understand the nature of what you've agreed to, Miss Simpson. I require efficiency, discretion, and competent household management. In return, you'll have security and status. Nothing more should be expected on either side. I understand perfectly, Your Grace, Milly replied, her voice hollow. After he left, her father embraced her with desperate gratitude, sobbing into her shoulder about salvation and answered prayers. Milly stood rigid in his arms, staring at the signed documents on the table. She had just sold herself to the cruel Duke of Gloucester for £8,000 and the preservation of her sister's happiness. The transaction was complete. 3 days passed in a blur of preparations that felt more like a funeral than a wedding. On Thursday morning, Milly stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom, while her sisters fluttered around her like anxious birds, fastening buttons and arranging silk. The gown had been her mother's ivory silk, with pearl beading at the bodice, carefully preserved these 7 years in tissue and lavender. Elizabeth had insisted, weeping as she lifted it from its box. "Mama would have wanted you to wear it," Elizabeth said, her hands gentle as she smoothed the fabric over Milly's shoulders. At 30, the Countess of Westmont carried herself with the assurance of a woman secure in her position, but her eyes were troubled as they met Milly's in the mirror. "You look beautiful," Jane breathed, always the romantic. She wove orange blossoms into Milly's dark hair with more enthusiasm than skill. "A true duchess." Charlotte said nothing. The middle sister stood by the window, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. At 8 and 20, Charlotte was closest to Milly in age and temperament, practical, observant, less inclined to pretty illusions than their younger siblings. "There," Elizabeth said finally, stepping back. "Perfect." Milly studied her reflection. The gown fit well enough, though she lacked her mother's statuesque elegance. The woman staring back at her looked pale, composed, and utterly resigned, a bride ascending the scaffold with dignity and tact. "Could you give us a moment?" Charlotte asked suddenly, looking at Elizabeth and Jane. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "We'll wait downstairs. Don't be long, the carriage will arrive soon." When they were alone, Charlotte moved to stand beside Milly, meeting her eyes in the mirror's glass. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly. "Charlotte, I mean it, Milly. I know what Papa's situation was. I know about the debts." Charlotte's voice was steady but urgent. "But there must be another way. You don't have to do this. You could come live with me in Ashford. We'd manage somehow." Milly turned to face her sister directly. "And what of Elizabeth's settlement? Of Jane's? The Duke's money is already dispersed. If I refuse him now, you'll all be dragged into the scandal. Jane's engagement would be ruined." "Jane's engagement isn't worth your happiness." "My happiness?" Milly smiled sadly. "Charlotte, I'm 7 and 20. I've been on the shelf so long I've gathered dust. This isn't a fairy tale ending I'm sacrificing. It's a practical arrangement that serves everyone's interests. Except yours. It serves mine too. I'll be a duchess. I'll have security, purpose, a household to manage." She straightened her shoulders. "This is my choice, freely made." Charlotte searched her face for a long moment, then pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You're the bravest of us all," she whispered, "and the most foolish." The chapel bells were chiming 10 when Milly descended the stairs. St. George's Chapel was mercifully small, the gathering intimate as the Duke had stipulated. Immediate family only, which meant her father and sisters, the Duke's elderly uncle, Lord Pembroke, and a handful of necessary witnesses. The pews were nearly empty, the silence oppressive. Henry Parsons waited at the altar with the same cold precision he brought to everything. His dark mourning coat was immaculate, his cravat expertly tied, his expression revealing nothing as Milly walked toward him on her father's arm. He might have been attending a business meeting rather than his own wedding. Her father trembled beside her, tears streaming down his face, tears of relief, of gratitude, of guilt he would never acknowledge. Milly kept her gaze fixed forward, her steps measured and steady. When they reached the altar, the Duke inclined his head a precise inch. No smile, no warmth, just acknowledgement that she had arrived as scheduled. The vicar began. Milly barely heard the words. The ceremony unfolded with mechanical efficiency, a legal proceeding dressed in religious garb. When the Duke spoke his vows, his voice was correct, clear, and utterly devoid of sentiment. He might have been reading from a ledger. "I, Henry Edward Parsons, take thee, Millicent Ann Simpson." The ring was heavy gold, impersonal and cold as he slid it onto her finger. His hands did not linger. His eyes did not meet hers with anything resembling affection or even interest. "You may kiss the bride," the vicar announced. The Duke merely inclined his head toward her, a formal gesture of acknowledgement, nothing more. No kiss, no pretense of romance. The assembly shifted uncomfortably. scandalized whispers rippling through the pews. Milly felt nothing, or perhaps she felt everything at once, a rushing torrent of grief and resignation that crashed over her and receded, leaving only numbness in its wake. They signed the register in silence. The scratch of pen on paper seemed deafening in the hushed chapel. She watched her hand form the letters of her new name, Millicent Parsons, Duchess of Gloucester. Millicent Simpson ceased to exist. In her place stood the Duchess of Gloucester. When they turned to face the assembly, her sisters were crying, Elizabeth dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, Jane weeping openly, Charlotte's jaw clenched against tears. Her father beamed with relief so profound it was obscene. In the back pew, Aunt Cordelia sat rigid with shock and envy, her mouth pinched with displeasure at this impossible elevation of her plain niece. Outside the chapel, a crested carriage waited, the Gloucester coat of arms gleaming in the April sunlight. The Duke handed her in with perfunctory courtesy, then climbed in across from her, not beside her, she noted. The opposite seat, the distance deliberate. "We leave for Gloucester House immediately," he announced as the carriage lurched into motion. "I have business there that requires attention. No wedding breakfast, no celebration. Just immediate departure to begin this new life of cold civility and practical arrangement." Milly nodded, her hands folded in her lap, the heavy gold ring strange on her finger. The Duke pulled out correspondence from his coat and began reading, his attention already elsewhere. They rolled through the London streets in silence, then out into the countryside beyond. Spring meadows blurred past the window, green and gold, and alive with possibility. Everything Milly's future would not be. She watched her husband, for that's what he was now, legally and irrevocably, as he read his letters with the same detached focus he brought to everything. This would be her marriage, sitting opposite a stranger who regarded her as a household acquisition, efficient, competent, reasonable, priced. The carriage wheels turned steadily, carrying her toward Gloucester House and the life she had purchased with her surrender. The transaction was complete. The future had begun. As Milly's carriage approached her new home, she faced an uncertain future with the cold Duke of Gloucester. The journey had stretched across 2 days, each mile reinforcing the careful distance her husband maintained between them. They stopped at posting inns where he arranged separate chambers with the same efficiency he applied to everything, treating her with polite courtesy that somehow felt more isolating than outright coldness. If you find yourself invested in discovering whether this frigid arrangement might transform into something more, whether Milly's quiet warmth could somehow reach Henry's frozen heart, I hope you'll follow along. Now, let's see what awaited Milly at Gloucester House. On the evening of the first day, at a respectable inn near Oxford, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression knocked on Milly's chamber door. "Your Grace, I'm Mr. Blackwood, His Grace's secretary. He requests I review the household accounts with you this evening, if you're not too fatigued from travel." Milly, who had been staring at the fire and contemplating her future, straightened. "Of course, please, come in." What followed was perhaps more overwhelming than the wedding itself. Mr. Blackwood spread ledgers across the small table, his finger tracing columns of figures that made Milly's head spin. The Gloucester estates employed over 300 servants across 5 properties. The annual household budget exceeded what her father had earned in a decade. "His Grace expects weekly reports on all major expenditures," Mr. Blackwood explained, not unkindly. "The previous arrangements were inadequate. He requires justification for every expense over £10. You'll find he has exacting standards." "I see," Milly murmured, studying the neat columns. "Exacting standards. Of course he did. Mrs. Thornbury, the head housekeeper, will assist you initially. She's served the family for 30 years. Mr. Blackwood hesitated. "His Grace can be demanding, but he's fair. If you maintain proper organization and efficiency, you'll find him reasonable to work with." Reasonable. The word felt like cold comfort. The second day's journey passed in similar silence. The Duke read correspondence, made notes, occasionally glanced out the window with an expression of calculation that suggested he was mentally cataloguing improvements to be made to every field and fence they passed. They arrived at Gloucester House in the late morning, mist still clinging to the grounds as the carriage rolled up the sweeping drive. Milly's breath caught. The house rose from the morning fog like something from a dream or a Gothic novel. Massive Jacobean architecture in honey-colored stone, dozens of chimneys piercing the sky, mullioned windows reflecting the pale sun. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. Impressive, but poorly organized, the Duke commented, following her gaze. My mother died when I was 8. Since then, management has been inadequate. My father had no interest in household matters, and the staff grew lax. You'll find much that needs correction. There was no emotion in his voice when he mentioned his mother, just the same clinical assessment he might apply to a failing business venture. The carriage stopped before the main entrance. Millie stepped out to find the entire household staff assembled in ranks, an intimidating sea of black uniforms and white aprons, housemaids, footmen, kitchen staff, grooms, gardeners, 300 servants, Mr. Blackwood had said. It looked like 3,000. At the front stood a tall, stern-faced woman in black bombazine, keys jangling at her waist. Her iron-grey hair was pulled into a severe knot, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes sharp as she assessed the new Duchess. Mrs. Thornbury, the Duke said. Her Grace, the Duchess of Gloucester. Mrs. Thornbury curtsied with perfect precision. Your Grace, welcome to Gloucester House. Mrs. Thornbury will show you to your chambers, the Duke continued, already turning toward the house. I have estate business requiring immediate attention. We dine at 7. Please be prompt. And with that, he disappeared into the house, leaving Millie standing before 300 strangers who were now somehow hers to command. Mrs. Thornbury's expression softened microscopically. If your Grace will follow me. The Duchess's apartments occupied the entire east wing of the second floor. Millie walked through room after magnificent room, a sitting room decorated in blues and silvers, a dressing room with wardrobes enough for a dozen women, a bedchamber dominated by a 4-poster bed hung with silk damask. The late Duchess's chambers, Mrs. Thornbury explained. They've been redecorated according to His Grace's specifications. Millie noticed a door on the far wall, heavy oak with brass fittings. And that leads to? His Grace's chambers. Your Grace. Mrs. Thornbury's tone became delicate. His Grace values his privacy. The door remains locked, unless he requires access. The words hung in the air. Unless he requires access. A business arrangement, nothing more. Even the architecture enforced their separation. I see, Millie said quietly. Thank you, Mrs. Thornbury. A young woman appeared in the doorway, pretty, perhaps 20, with auburn hair and quick, nervous hands. Your Grace, I'm Martha. His Grace assigned me as your lady's maid. I'll help you settle in. As Martha unpacked Millie's modest trunk, so few gowns to fill these enormous wardrobes, she chatted with the easy gossip of servants who assume their mistress wants entertainment. We're all so relieved you're here, Your Grace. The house has been, well, His Grace is very particular, you see, very exacting. The last housekeeper before Mrs. Thornbury lasted only 3 months, and the one before that. She trailed off, realizing she'd said too much. I understand, Millie said, though she didn't. Not really, but Mrs. Thornbury says you seem sensible. That's what's needed, she says. Someone sensible who won't take His Grace's manner personally. Martha lowered her voice. He's not cruel, Your Grace, just cold. Always has been, they say, even as a boy. At 7 o'clock precisely, Millie descended to dinner. The dining room could have seated 50. Tonight it seated 2, positioned at opposite ends of a table so long that conversation would require shouting. The Duke sat in his place, already served, examining papers beside his plate. He looked up as she entered. You're prompt, good. The meal proceeded in near silence. 7 courses served with military precision, while Millie picked at her food, and the Duke reviewed documents between bites. When he did speak, his questions were purely administrative. Mrs. Thornbury informed me of several household matters requiring your attention. The linen inventory is incomplete. The accounts for last quarter show unexplained discrepancies. I'll need your assessment by week's end. Of course, Your Grace. Henry, he corrected absently. You're my wife. Henry will suffice in private. It was the closest thing to intimacy he'd offered. After dinner, he withdrew to his study. Millie returned to her chambers, where Martha helped her undress and prepared her for bed. When the maid finally left, Millie stood alone in the vast room, wearing a nightgown that had seemed adequate at home but felt shabby here, surrounded by silk and silver. She climbed into the enormous bed and lay staring at the canopy above. From beyond the locked connecting door, she could hear movement, footsteps, a drawer opening, the low murmur of a male voice, presumably speaking to his valet, her husband, a stranger on the other side of a locked door. Millie closed her eyes against the tears that threatened. This was her life now, this magnificent prison, this cold civility, this carefully maintained distance. She was a duchess. She was utterly alone. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. Millie threw herself into household management with the determination of a drowning person clinging to driftwood. The first month passed in a blur of inventories, ledgers, and endless consultations with Mrs. Thornbury. What she discovered was chaos masquerading as order. 3 previous housekeepers had each implemented their own systems without dismantling the old ones, creating a labyrinth of conflicting procedures that left the staff confused and resources wasted. "The linen inventory shows 200 sheets for the guest wing," Millie said, comparing ledgers in Mrs. Thornbury's office. "But the actual count is 147. Where are the missing 53? Mrs. Thornbury's expression tightened with something like respect. "Lost in the confusion, Your Grace. Mrs. Henderson's system and Mrs. Price's system never reconciled properly." The staff watched her with wary eyes those first weeks, waiting to see if she would be another imperious mistress demanding impossible standards, or worse, another failure who would be gone within months. Millie understood their hesitation. She had been watching people her entire life, learning to read unspoken fears and resentments. So she consolidated the inventories herself, working late into the night with Martha's help. She streamlined the purchasing system, eliminating duplicate orders and negotiating better terms with suppliers. She reorganized the staff schedules to be more efficient while ensuring adequate rest periods. A radical notion that earned her suspicious gratitude from the exhausted chambermaids, and she treated them all with the same courtesy she would have afforded her equals, remembering names, asking after sick children, thanking them for their work. Gradually, the wariness melted into something warmer. The housemaids began to smile when she passed. The footmen stood straighter, took pride in their work. Cook sent up special dishes without being asked, the Duke noticed. "The household accounts are well managed," he commented one evening at dinner, not looking up from his papers. An improvement. It was the closest thing to praise she had received from him. Their dinner conversations remained limited to household business, but they grew slightly longer each week. He began to ask her opinion on estate matters. Should they repair the tenant cottages now or wait until spring? Was the new gardener's proposal for the rose garden reasonable? His questions were clinical, but at least he asked. In the 6th week of her residence at Gloucester House, Millie discovered the library. She had wandered into it by accident, seeking a book to occupy her sleepless hours. What she found stole her breath: a 3-story marvel with soaring ceilings, galleries reached by spiral staircases, and thousands upon thousands of volumes lining the walls. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits among the shelves. She stood transfixed, turning slowly to take it all in. This was treasure beyond gold knowledge, stories, ideas collected across generations. Her fingers trailed along the spines as she walked, reading titles: history, philosophy, science, poetry. And there Shakespeare, the complete works in a beautiful edition bound in green Morocco leather. She was examining Hamlet, absorbed in Ophelia's mad scene, when footsteps made her start. The Duke stood in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but something else beneath it. "You read Shakespeare?" His tone suggested this was as unexpected as finding her performing acrobatics. Millie lifted her chin, defensive. "My education was limited, but my mother loved literature. She read to us every evening before she died." She hesitated. "I hope I'm not intruding. No one told me the library was forbidden." "It's not." He moved into the room, his boots silent on the thick carpet. "I'm merely surprised. Most ladies prefer novels." "I like novels too," she said. "But Shakespeare understood people, the way they lie to themselves, the way love and duty tear them apart." She stopped, suddenly aware she'd revealed too much. Henry approached, his grey eyes fixed on the volume in her hands. "What do you think of that edition? It's beautiful. The annotations are particularly helpful." He studied her for a long moment, then reached past her close enough that she caught the scent of leather and something woodsy, and pulled another volume from the shelf. "Try this one instead. The Johnson edition. His commentary is superior." His fingers brushed hers as he handed her the book. It was the first time they had touched since their wedding, and Millie felt something spark in that brief contact awareness. Perhaps recognition that they were more than ledgers and household accounts. When she looked up, she found him watching her with new intensity, as though seeing her properly for the first time. "When we are private," he said slowly, "you may call me Henry." Her heart stuttered. "Then you must call me Millie." Something shifted in his severe expression, not quite a smile, but a softening, the ghost of warmth in those cold grey eyes. "Millie," he repeated, testing the name. "It suits you better than Millicent." After that evening, a new pattern emerged. Dinner remained formal, but afterward, instead of retreating to his study, Henry would say, "I'll be in the library if you wish to join me." An invitation, not a command. She always accepted. They would sit in adjacent chairs by the fire, a careful distance maintained, but closer than the opposite ends of the dining table, and discuss what they'd read: books, philosophy, poetry, ideas. In the library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, Henry's coldness thawed slightly. He became animated when arguing a point, gesturing with the book in his hand. His intelligence was formidable, his observations sharp, but he listened to her responses with genuine attention. "The romantics are overwrought," Millie declared one evening, setting down a volume of Byron. "All passion and no sense." Henry's lips twitched almost a smile. "That's rather the point of romanticism. The point can be made without quite so much swooning." And then miraculously he laughed, an actual laugh, brief but genuine, that transformed his entire face. "You have wit, Millie. I appreciate that quality." She felt emboldened by the warmth in his voice. "I'm glad something about me meets your approval." The moment she said it, she regretted the bitterness that had crept in. But Henry didn't withdraw. Instead, he set down his book and looked at her directly, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "You exceed my expectations," he said quietly. "In several respects." He seemed to want to say more, his lips parted, his brow furrowed slightly, but whatever vulnerability had begun to surface, he pulled back from it. The walls rebuilt themselves in an instant. "It's late," he said, rising. "Good night, Millie." "Good night, Henry." That night, lying in her vast bed, Millie stared at the canopy and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since accepting his proposal: hope. Not the foolish hope of love, she told herself firmly. She had signed away any claim to that. But perhaps they could build something else. Companionship, mutual respect, a meeting of minds, if not hearts. It was more than she'd dared to expect when she'd signed those papers in her father's shabby drawing room. Through the locked door, she heard Henry moving in his chamber. She wondered if he, too, lay awake, thinking of their conversation, wondering what this fragile thing between them might become if carefully tended. The lock remained fixed. The door stayed closed. But the wall it represented felt, for the first time, slightly less insurmountable. Outside her window, spring deepened into summer, and inside Gloucester House, something equally subtle had begun to bloom. The Dowager Duchess of Gloucester arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning in late June. Millie was reviewing the quarterly accounts with Mr. Blackwood when Mrs. Thornbury burst into the morning room, her usually composed face flushed with alarm. "Your Grace." "Her Grace is here. The Dowager Duchess." Millie looked up sharply. Henry had mentioned his stepmother exactly once, in passing, his tone suggesting the subject was closed. "She lives in Bath. We are not close." But here she was. The woman who swept into the drawing-room was formidable, tall, silver-haired, dressed in expensive black silk, despite being out of mourning for more than a decade. She had the same sharp grey eyes as her stepson, but where Henry's were cold, hers blazed with intelligence and something that might have been anger or grief, carefully banked. "So," she said without preamble, "you are the new Duchess." Millie rose and curtsied. "Your Grace, this is an unexpected pleasure." "I doubt that." The Dowager circled her slowly, examining like a buyer at a livestock auction. Millie held herself still, refusing to be cowed. She had faced worse than aristocratic scrutiny. "Not beautiful," the Dowager pronounced. "Not particularly accomplished, I'd wager. No fortune, no connections. Yet Henry chose you." She stopped directly before Millie. "Why?" The bluntness was shocking, but Millie met her gaze steadily. His Grace required an efficient household manager. Ah. Something flickered in those sharp eyes, approval perhaps, for the honesty. "Command tea, let me see how you handle the servants." It was a test. Millie understood that immediately. She rang for Mrs. Thornbury and gave crisp, courteous instructions. The tea arrived precisely prepared, the service impeccable. The Dowager watched everything: how Millie spoke to the staff, how they responded, the efficiency of the operation. "Adequate," she said, which somehow felt like high praise. "Now sit. We will speak plainly." Milly poured tea with steady hands, though her heart raced. "Of course, Your Grace. Does my son treat you well?" The question was sharp, probing. Milly chose her words carefully. "His Grace is unfailingly courteous." "Courteous?" The dowager's lip curled slightly. "A damning word. Does he speak to you beyond household matters?" "Yes." Milly set down her cup. "We discussed books in the library after dinner." The dowager went utterly still. Her teacup trembled slightly in her hand before she set it down with excessive care. "Books? In the library?" "He shares his library with you." "Yes, Your Grace. Nearly every evening." "Good God." The older woman stood abruptly and moved to the window, her back to Milly. When she spoke again, her voice was different, softer, weighted with old pain. "Then perhaps there is hope for him after all." "I don't understand." The dowager turned, and her expression was no longer testing but unbearably sad. "No, you wouldn't. Henry would never speak of it." She returned to her chair. But her posture had changed, no longer imperious but weary. "Tell me, child, what do you know of Henry's father?" "Very little, only that he was the previous Duke. Richard Parsons was brilliant, a genius in mathematics, in strategy, in business. He doubled the family fortune. He was also one of the cruelest men I've ever known." The dowager's hands clenched in her lap. "He believed emotion was weakness. Any display of feeling in his son was met with punishment. A child who cried was locked in darkness until he learned not to weep. A boy who laughed too loudly was denied meals until he mastered proper restraint." Milly felt ice creep through her veins. Henry was a child. Henry was his heir, his project, to be molded into perfection. The dowager's voice cracked. "I tried to protect him. For 3 years I tried. But Richard turned his cruelty on me as well, and eventually, God forgive me, I fled. I left that little boy alone with a monster." "How old was he?" 8. 8 years old. The same age Henry had been when he told Milly his mother died. But it hadn't been his mother, it had been his stepmother, the only person who had tried to shield him from his father's calculated brutality. "I thought once Richard died Henry might heal," the dowager continued. "But by then, he was 24. The damage was complete. He had forgotten how to feel, how to connect, how to love. He survived by becoming exactly what his father wanted, cold, controlled, emotionless." She looked at Milly with fierce intensity. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I think so." "You say he shares his library with you, discusses books." The dowager leaned forward. "Those are chinks in his armor, child. The library was young Henry's refuge, his secret joy. His father forbade literature as frivolous, but the boy would sneak down at night to read by candlelight. It was the only rebellion he permitted himself, the only place he could still feel." Milly's throat tightened. She thought of Henry in the library, the way his severe expression softened when discussing Shakespeare. The rare laugh, the ghost of warmth in his eyes. "I came here expecting to find my stepson had acquired another in a string of failed housekeepers," the dowager said. "Instead, I find a woman he invites into his sanctuary, a woman he speaks to with something approaching openness." She reached across and gripped Milly's hand with surprising strength. "Now you must choose. Will you accept a cold marriage of convenience and simply manage his estates? Or will you fight for the man Henry could be the man he was before his father destroyed him?" "I don't know if I can." "He has spent 27 years building walls." The dowager's grip tightened. "But I've watched you this past hour. You're kind, but you have steel beneath it. You're firm with the servants, but not cruel. You're intelligent, resourceful, and you don't cower." Her eyes blazed. "You could be his salvation, if you're brave enough to try. What if he doesn't want to be saved? Then you'll have tried and failed, which is still more noble than never trying at all." The dowager released her hand and stood. "I must return to Bath. My presence disturbs him, reminds him of losses he cannot process. But I needed to see who had breached his defenses, however slightly." She moved to the door, then paused. "One more thing. Henry believes I abandoned him because I was weak. He doesn't know I fled because his father threatened to kill me if I interfered again. Let him keep his anger at me, it's safer than the alternative. But you, child, you he's allowed into his library, into his refuge. Don't waste that gift." After the dowager left, Milly sat alone in the drawing room for a long time. That evening at dinner, she watched Henry differently, studied the precise way he cut his meat, the careful control in every gesture, the way he never quite met her eyes for more than a moment. She had thought him cold because he was cruel. Now she understood he was cold because cruelty had taught him that feeling anything was dangerous. 8 years old, locked in darkness for crying, denied food for laughing too loudly. When he excused himself after dinner, he paused. "Will you join me in the library?" "Yes," Millie said. "I'd like that very much." As she followed him down the corridor, she made her choice. The dowager had offered her 2 paths: comfortable resignation or uncertain struggle. Millie had spent her life being practical, sensible, resigned to less than she deserved. Perhaps it was time to be brave instead. She entered the library and closed the door behind her, ready to fight for a man who had forgotten he was worth fighting for. Lady Arabella Pembroke arrived in the 4th month of Millie's marriage, claiming to be passing through on her way to Scotland. "She's requested 3 days' accommodation, Mrs. Thornbury informed Millie, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes skeptical. His Grace agreed, though I could tell he was displeased. Millie's chest tightened. She had heard the name whispered by servants, Henry's former understanding, the beautiful Lady Arabella, who everyone expected him to marry. That evening before dinner, Henry appeared at her chamber door, his expression uncomfortable. "Millie, about Lady Pembroke. Before our marriage, she and I had a brief arrangement. Society expected an announcement." He met her eyes directly. It was never serious, purely business, like ours began. But she proved manipulative and indiscreet. "I ended it before any official engagement." He paused. "She leaves in 3 days. I give you my word." Dinner was excruciating. Arabella wore striking crimson silk that made Millie's modest blue gown look positively dowdy. She was everything Millie was not: beautiful, elegant, effortlessly charming, and cruel. "Country life must suit those accustomed to reduced circumstances," Arabella said sweetly, examining Millie over her wine-glass. "How lovely you've adapted to rural isolation." "I find it peaceful," Millie replied evenly. "Of course." Arabella's smile didn't reach her eyes. Surely His Grace didn't marry simply to acquire a glorified housekeeper. Henry's fork clattered against his plate. "Lady Pembroke, I would appreciate if you would show my wife the courtesy her position demands." The words were ice, and Arabella subsided, but her eyes promised retribution. It came the next morning, when Millie was alone in the library. "How cozy you've made yourself," Arabella said from the doorway, her voice dripping poison. "Henry and I were practically betrothed, you know, based on genuine affection and social compatibility. Then he married you, a woman with no fortune, no connections, no beauty." She moved closer. "He chose you to avoid scandal, to acquire household management. Eventually, he'll resent his practical choice." "That's not," Millie began, but Arabella cut her off. "You're developing feelings for him. How unfortunate." Her laugh was brittle. "Henry is incapable of love. He told me so himself, repeatedly. Whatever warmth you think you see is merely courtesy to a competent employee." Millie fled to her chambers, Arabella's words echoing in her skull. Incapable of love, a competent employee. He'll resent his practical choice. She was standing at the window, tears streaming down her face, when she heard the connecting door unlock. Henry stood in the doorway, his expression thunderous. "What did she say to you?" "Nothing that wasn't true," Millie whispered, not turning around. "Millie." He crossed the room in 3 strides, turning her to face him. "What did she say?" The story spilled out, every poisonous word, every calculated barb. Henry's jaw tightened with each sentence. "I did marry you for practical reasons," he said finally. "I won't lie about that." He took her hands, his grip warm and desperate. "But Millie, you have become so much more than I anticipated. You are my companion, my intellectual equal, my—" He struggled with the word, decades of conditioning fighting against the truth. "My happiness." Millie stared at him, barely breathing. "I wake anticipating our conversations," he continued, the words coming faster now, as though a dam had broken. "When you're not present, Gloucester House feels empty. You've made me laugh. You've made me feel. I thought I'd forgotten how, but you've awakened something I believed my father had killed." His hands trembled slightly. "What I feel for you is either love or so close the distinction is meaningless." "Henry." He kissed her. Not the cold brush of lips at a wedding altar, but a kiss full of desperate tenderness, years of suppressed emotion breaking free. Millie melted into him, her hands fisting in his coat, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "If you're willing," he said quietly. "I would like to stay here tonight. Not from duty, but because I cannot bear to be apart any longer." Millie's answer was to kiss him again. Later, wrapped in Henry's arms for the first time, the connecting door left symbolically open, Millie felt the last of her walls crumble. This cold marriage of convenience had become something neither of them had dared to hope for: love. 3 months after Arabella's departure, Millie and Henry prepared to return to London society. Their private love had transformed them both. Henry laughed freely now, touched her hand across the breakfast table, called her "my dear" instead of Millie when emotion overwhelmed him. But would society accept their unconventional beginning? If you followed Millie's journey from overlooked spinster to beloved duchess, if you believe in love's power to heal and transform, I hope you'll continue with us. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for love. And tell us, do you believe the cruel Duke truly changed, or was his warmth always there, waiting? Now, let's see their triumph. "We cannot hide at Gloucester House forever," Millie said one morning. "Society will interpret our absence as shame. I won't have our children bear whispers about their parents' marriage." Henry's expression darkened protectively. "I will not tolerate anyone treating you with disrespect." Then we faced them together. The Duke of Ashford's ball marked their return, the first major event of the London season. When their carriage arrived, shocked whispers rippled through the assembled guests. Millie wore deep emerald silk and the complete Gloucester jewels, emeralds and diamonds, that proclaimed her position beyond question. Henry's pride was evident in every glance, every possessive hand at her waist. Lady Ashford greeted them with sharp curiosity. "Your Graces, what a delightful surprise." But it was Arabella's presence that made the evening treacherous. Surrounded by admirers, she watched Millie with calculated sympathy. She had spent 3 months poisoning London with tales of their loveless arrangement. Arabella approached with false concern. "Your Grace, how wonderful to see you in London. I understood you preferred isolation to society's amusements." "We've been occupied with estate matters," Millie replied evenly. "Of course." Arabella's smile was venomous. "One wonders if the Duchess finds sufficient stimulation. A woman of limited background might struggle with the demands of your position." She turned to Henry. "Surely you must sometimes regret not choosing someone more suited to ducal life." The ballroom fell silent. Henry's expression went deadly cold, not the old coldness born of suppressed emotion, but the focused fury of a man defending what he loved most. "I will say this once clearly." His voice cut through the silence like a blade. He took Millie's hand and raised it to his lips with tender reverence. "I have never regretted my marriage, not for a single moment." He turned to face the assembly, still holding Millie's hand. "My wife is the most remarkable woman I have ever known. She possesses intelligence that challenges me, compassion that humbles me, and strength that inspires me. She transformed Gloucester House from a monument to efficiency into a home. More than that, she transformed me from someone merely going through the motions of living into someone who actually lives." His voice softened, but every word carried. "What began as a practical arrangement has become the greatest blessing of my existence. I love my wife completely, devotedly, far more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." He looked directly at Arabella. "Anyone who questions my wife's suitability will find themselves unwelcome in my homes and unwelcome in my company." The Dowager Duchess appeared at the edge of the crowd, her fierce approval evident. "Well said, Henry. The girl has done what I hoped reminded you that you're human." One by one, influential figures murmured agreement. The tide of society shifted visibly. Arabella made a strangled excuse and fled the ballroom. Then Henry pulled Millie into his arms, scandalously improper in a public ballroom, and kissed her before the entire assembly. Not a brief brush of lips, but a kiss that proclaimed his devotion beyond any possible doubt. When they finally broke apart, Millie was laughing and crying at once. This wasn't victory over Arabella. This was victory over loneliness, isolation, and the belief that practical arrangements could never become real love. 2 years later, in the library at Gloucester House, Henry lay on the carpet playing with their daughter Catherine. The stern Duke of Gloucester made ridiculous faces, while the baby shrieked with laughter. "Who's the most brilliant baby in England?" he cooed. "You are. Yes, you are." Millie watched from her chair, one hand resting on her stomach where their second child grew. Henry looked up and caught her expression. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant again." His face transformed with joy. In one fluid motion, he stood and crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair to press a kiss to her stomach, then her lips. "How did I become so fortunate?" he whispered. "We found each other," Milly replied simply. Catherine babbled from the carpet. Henry retrieved her, settling beside Milly with their daughter between them. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that comes from complete understanding, from love that has been tested and proven true. The locked door had been removed entirely years ago. The walls Henry spent a lifetime building had crumbled, and in their place grew something neither had dared to hope for: a family, a home, a love that transformed them both. It is never too late to be seen, chosen, and cherished for exactly who you are.